He conquered the known world by age 30. Alexander the Great didn't just win battles, he rewrote history itself. From Macedonia to Egypt to the edges of India, entire civilizations fell before him. Armies that outnumbered his forces 10 to 1 crumbled under his strategic genius. Generals wept at his feet. Kings surrendered without raising a sword. The world had never seen anything like it. But here's what nobody tells you. The moment Alexander became a god, he stopped being a man. And that's when everything started to fall apart. Picture this. It's 331 BC, and Alexander stands in the temple of Amun-Ra in Egypt. The high priest approaches him with words that should have terrified any mortal soul. He tells Alexander that he is the son of Amun, the divine incarnation of the sun god himself. In that instant, something shifted inside the young conqueror. This wasn't just flattery from priests desperate to avoid bloodshed. This was the official declaration that Alexander was no longer bound by human limitations. He believed it, and that belief became his greatest weapon and his deadliest poison. Think about what that does to a mind. You're 25 years old, you've never lost a battle. Every general you face falls before you can even deploy your full strategy. Every city you approach surrenders before you breach the walls. And now priests are telling you that you're literally a god on earth. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally, divine, immortal, chosen by the heavens themselves. The intoxication of that belief runs deeper than any wine. It's not just power, it's cosmic validation. It's permission to do anything because you're beyond the rules that bind mortal men. And Alexander didn't just accept this divinity, he demanded it. He demanded his generals to bow before him as if he were a god. He demanded Persian court rituals of submission. He made men who had fought beside him, men who had bled for him, men who had trusted him with their lives, perform the act of prostronesis, the full bodily prostration reserved only for gods.
Some of his oldest companions refused. They were Macedonians, free men. They bowed to no one but their king, and even that was conditional. But Alexander wasn't just their king anymore. He was a god, and gods demand worship, not loyalty. This is where the fracture began. This is where the empire's foundation started to crack. The soldiers noticed the change first. Alexander became increasingly erratic. He would shower his favorites with impossible rewards, entire cities, mountains of gold, absolute power over provinces. Then, days later, he would have them executed in fits of rage that seemed to come from nowhere. His longtime friend Philotas was accused of treason, tortured, and executed while Alexander watched. Parmenion, the brilliant general who had helped build Alexander's early military reputation, was hunted down and murdered on Alexander's orders. The paranoia spread like plague. If you were close to Alexander, you could be executed. If you were distant, you could be executed for disloyalty. There was no winning. There was only the constant, suffocating terror of wondering if today would be the day you fell out of favor forever. The man who had united the most powerful army the world had ever seen was now systematically destroying the very trust that held it together, and he didn't even realize it was happening. But the real collapse wasn't happening in the throne room. It was happening in Alexander's body. His health was deteriorating in ways nobody wanted to admit. Constant drinking became his escape from the pressure of playing God. A wound from battle in India that never quite healed kept him in pain. Fever would strike without warning. Some days he could barely stand. Other days he was fine, sharp, commanding. The inconsistency bred more confusion among his generals. Nobody knew which Alexander would appear each morning, the brilliant strategist or the paranoid tyrant, the visionary or the broken man. And that uncertainty was destroying everything he'd built. His empire had stretched from Greece to India, spanning 3 million square miles.
He had unified people who had hated each other for centuries. He had built cities in his name that would stand for thousands of years. He had accomplished what every historian said was impossible. He had done the impossible so many times that people actually believed he was divine. But you can't maintain an empire the size of Alexander's through force alone. You can't hold together 3 million square miles of conquered territory with just military might. You need trust. You need loyalty. You need generals who believe in the cause, not just the commander. You need a system that outlasts the personality of one man, no matter how extraordinary that man is. Alexander had none of that anymore. He was the empire. Everything flowed through him. Every decision required his approval. Every conflict came to him for judgment. And as his paranoia grew, as his health declined, as his judgment became increasingly questionable, the entire structure began to collapse under the weight of his own divinity.
The generals could feel it. His empire, which had seemed eternal just years before, suddenly felt fragile. They began making moves to protect themselves, to secure their own futures, to build their own power bases in preparation for the inevitable moment when Alexander could no longer hold everything together. They didn't know it yet, but that moment was coming faster than anyone expected. Alexander was dying. And when he died, everything he had built would shatter into pieces in a matter of weeks.
The God King had created a miracle, but he had forgotten the oldest rule of history. Miracles don't last. They're meant to dazzle and inspire, but they're not meant to endure. And the moment you mistake a miracle for a sustainable system, you've already lost everything. The turning point came during the siege of the city of Tyre. This was no longer the invincible Alexander who had swept through Persia with brilliant tactics and overwhelming confidence. This was something different, something darker. Tyre had refused to surrender. The city sat on an island offshore, protected by walls that seemed impregnable. Alexander demanded entry. The city refused. And in that moment, something snapped inside the young conqueror. He didn't want to capture Tyre anymore. He wanted to obliterate it. He wanted to make an example so brutal that no other city would ever dare refuse him again. He ordered his men to build a causeway across the sea to reach the island. It was engineering genius combined with sheer madness. Thousands of workers, thousands of soldiers, months of construction under brutal conditions. Men died by the hundreds, diseases spread. The project seemed impossible, but Alexander didn't care about the cost anymore. He was a god now, and gods didn't accept refusal. When the Macedonian army finally breached Tyre's walls, the slaughter was apocalyptic. 8,000 residents were executed, 30,000 were enslaved. The city itself was almost completely destroyed. Alexander walked through the ruins and declared victory, but his generals understood what had actually happened. Their brilliant commander had become someone they didn't recognize anymore, someone capable of genocide for wounded pride. This is the moment historians often miss when they talk about Alexander's decline. It wasn't a sudden collapse, it was a pattern that accelerated. Each act of cruelty justified the next one. Each paranoid decision fed the next suspicion. Each execution of a trusted advisor made the remaining generals trust him less and themselves more. The army began to fracture from within. Officers started forming factions. Some remained loyal to Alexander out of genuine belief. Others stayed close out of fear of what would happen if they left. Others began secretly planning for the empire's inevitable dissolution. Conversations happened in dark tents that never reached the ears of the divine king. Plans were made, allegiances were formed, backup plans were prepared. Then came the Hyphasis River in India. Alexander's army had marched thousands of miles. They had won every battle. They had conquered every city. But they had reached the edge of their endurance. The soldiers were exhausted. The supplies were running low. The heat was unbearable. Mutiny was in the air like a smell before a storm. Alexander wanted to push forward, to conquer more, to expand his empire even further. But his army finally said no. They refused to march further east. They refused to follow their god-king into what they knew would be certain death. It was the first time in his entire conquering career that Alexander's will had been directly defied by his own people. And he couldn't do anything about it. He couldn't execute the entire army. He couldn't conquer the world if his soldiers refused to fight. For the first time, Alexander understood that his power had limits. For the first time, he realized that even gods answer to men. He was devastated, betrayed, furious. He withdrew to his tent and refused to see anyone for days. When he finally emerged, something had broken inside him. He agreed to turn back, but he never forgave his army for their refusal. He never trusted them the same way again.
The return journey was a nightmare. Alexander's health deteriorated rapidly. The fevers came more frequently. His decisions became increasingly erratic. He would order the execution of officers for minor infractions, then forget he'd given the order days later. He mixed alcohol with medication that his court physicians gave him, combinations that were almost certainly toxic. His paranoia reached fever pitch. One night, he became convinced that his closest advisor, Hephaestion, had betrayed him. He had the man imprisoned. But the very next day, racked with guilt and confusion, Alexander released him and publicly embraced him as his dearest friend. The emotional whiplash was exhausting everyone around him. The court didn't know what to expect anymore. Meanwhile, the empire was beginning to show signs of strain. Messages came from governors in distant provinces complaining that they hadn't received instructions from Alexander in months. Trade routes that had been secure were becoming dangerous as local authorities lost their fear of the central government. Rebellion was stirring in Egypt. Unrest was spreading through Syria. The vast machinery that Alexander had built through conquest and terror was beginning to rust from neglect and uncertainty. The generals understood what was happening, even if Alexander didn't want to acknowledge it. Their god-king was failing. The miraculous run was ending, and when it ended, there would be chaos. The question wasn't if the empire would collapse. The question was how violently it would shatter, and who would be standing when the pieces stopped falling. Some of his generals began making their own plans. Macedonian generals who had conquered the world with Alexander were now quietly positioning themselves for the empire's division. They knew each other too well. They had fought beside each other for too long. They understood that whoever tried to hold the whole empire together would be destroyed by the others who wanted their own piece of the pie.
The tragedy of it all was that nobody wanted to admit what was happening. Alexander was only 32 years old, the man who had conquered most of the known world in a decade, the man who seemed destined to live forever, the man who had demanded to be treated as a god. And yet, there were growing whispers among his most trusted advisors, whispers that the Sun King was dying, whispers that his body was failing him, whispers about how quickly everything could fall apart once he was gone. Some of these whispers were carefully orchestrated by men already planning their futures. Others were just the fearful observations of exhausted generals watching their immortal leader slowly fade into mortality. Alexander heard these whispers. He had to have heard them, but he refused to acknowledge them. A god doesn't admit to weakness. A god doesn't plan for mortality. A god doesn't prepare his empire for the day when he's no longer there to hold it together. And that refusal to accept reality would cost him everything.
Babylon, June 323 BC. Alexander lay dying in a room that didn't have windows. Or maybe it did. Historians argue about this detail like it matters, like the lighting would somehow change what happened next. What mattered
was that the man who had united the largest empire in the ancient world was now so weak that he couldn't stand without assistance. Fever ravaged his body. Infection had set into that old wound from India. His organs were failing. His mind drifted between lucidity and delirium. The generals surrounded him, waiting, watching, each one calculating what his death would mean for them personally. Some of them wept. Some were performing grief for the benefit of others. Some felt nothing but cold calculation. They had all seen too much, done too much, sacrificed too much together to waste their time on genuine emotion now. Alexander spoke. His voice was barely a whisper. The generals leaned in to hear. He told them to place his ring on the pillow next to him. His ring, the symbol of absolute power over the empire. He didn't name a successor. He didn't give instructions for the succession. He didn't outline a plan for how the empire should be governed after his death. He just left his ring on the pillow and waited for the end. What happened next defines the entire tragedy of Alexander's reign. Within hours of his death, his generals gathered together and held a council. They didn't mourn him. They didn't reflect on his accomplishments. They didn't plan a funeral befitting the man who had conquered half the world. Instead, they immediately began the process of dividing the empire among themselves.
Ptolemy took Egypt. He understood that Egypt was the richest province, the most stable, the most defensible. He locked himself into Alexandria and essentially checked out of empire politics. Seleucus took Mesopotamia and Persia, the core of Alexander's Asian empire. Antigonus took Macedonia itself and parts of Asia Minor. Lysimachus took Thrace. The division happened almost instantly. It was as if they had already planned it, which they probably had. The wars that followed lasted decades. General fought general. Former brothers-in-arms became mortal enemies. Armies that had conquered the known world now fought each other in civil wars for pieces of Alexander's empire. Millions of people died in wars that Alexander's generals fought against each other. Within 5 years, Alexander's united empire had completely dissolved. Within 20 years, the Hellenistic world had settled into 3 major kingdoms, each ruled by one of Alexander's generals or their descendants. Within 50 years, new powers were rising. Rome was becoming dominant. Egypt was slowly fading. The Persian Empire's successor states were weakening. Everything Alexander had built through years of military genius and brutal conquest was gone. But here's what's so fascinating about this collapse. It didn't have to happen this way. Alexander's empire didn't fail because it was conquered. It didn't fail because of external enemies. It failed because Alexander never created a system that could survive without him. Think about what other great empires did differently. The Roman Empire had a system of succession that, while often messy and violent, generally ensured that there was always someone in charge who understood the responsibility of holding it all together. The Persians had an administrative structure that could survive the death of any one ruler. Even the Egyptian pharaohs had established traditions and institutions that made the transition from one ruler to the next a manageable process. Alexander had none of that. He was the empire. Everything flowed through him. Every decision required his wisdom. Every conflict required his judgment. He was so extraordinary as a leader that his system didn't need anyone else. It needed him specifically. And the moment he died, that system became worthless. The deeper tragedy is that Alexander understood this on some level. He knew his generals. He knew that left to their own devices, they would tear the empire apart. He knew that they didn't love him, they feared him. He knew that the moment he was gone, they would become predators instead of servants, and yet he did nothing to prepare for it. He had conquered the world. He had done what philosophers and generals and kings had said was impossible. He had unified people who had hated each other for centuries.
He had built a new world order that nobody thought could exist. And then he threw it away by refusing to accept that he was mortal and that systems need to survive their creators. Some historians argue that Alexander's legacy isn't his empire, because his empire fell apart. They say his true legacy is cultural, the spread of Greek civilization throughout the Mediterranean and Asia, the blending of cultures, the foundation for the Hellenistic age. And that's true. The cultural impact of Alexander's conquests did last for centuries. It did reshape civilization. That's real, and that's powerful. But it's not what Alexander wanted. Alexander wanted to build an empire that would last forever. He wanted his name remembered forever. He wanted to create something eternal. And in that specific ambition, he failed completely. The saddest part is that he came so close. If he had lived another decade, if he had thought about succession instead of just thinking about conquest, if he had built administrative structures instead of just military ones, if he had created a system of shared power instead of concentrated power in himself, everything could have been different. His empire could have lasted. It could have evolved. It could have faced challenges and adapted. Instead, it collapsed into civil war within years of his death, and his generals spent the next decades fighting each other instead of building something new together. Alexander learned too late what every truly great leader eventually learns, that your greatest accomplishment isn't what you build during your lifetime. Your greatest accomplishment is what continues to stand after you're gone. It's the systems you create, the people you develop, the structures you build that can survive without you. Alexander the Great conquered the world, but couldn't conquer his own mortality. He defeated every enemy he faced, but couldn't defeat his own ego. He united civilizations, but couldn't create the unity that would survive his absence. And that's the eternal lesson of Alexander. Not that he was great, he was, but greatness without wisdom is just a slow-motion disaster waiting to happen, and when it happens, everything you built falls down. His empire lasted 300 years in its various successor forms, but Alexander's unified empire lasted less than a year after his death. That's not a legacy. That's a warning.